Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello dear learners, welcome to the session of Managerial Economics. I am Dr. Supriya Jain, working as an assistant professor in the Institute of Business Management at GLA University, Mathura. Let us look at the topics we have covered in our previous session. In the previous session, we have talked about demand, what demand is, and we have seen that demand will be an effective only when a person is having a desire, willingness and ability to pay for it. Thereafter, we have talked about different types of demand, where we have discussed about direct and derived demand, recurring and replacement demand, competing and complementary goods demand, and we have also talked about individual and market demand. Thereafter, we have also talked about the determinants of demand, what are the factors which affects the demand of the commodity, and when we have seen the various impact. Some of the determinants were having positive relationship on demand, whereas some are having inverse relationship. But the most prominent determinant which affect the demand of any commodity is the price, and it is inversely proportionate to it. Thereafter, we have talked about demand function, where we have seen how we could have established the mathematical relationship between the demand and its determinant. Demand schedule is a tabular representation, where we have seen how the change in the prices causes the change in the quantity demanded, whereas demand curve is your graphical representation, and demand curve will always be downward sloping, showing that there is an inverse relationship between the price and the demand, and demand curve can be linear as well as non-linear, depending upon how much change has been taken place in the quantity demanded due to the change in the prices. Then we have talked about the movements on demand curve, and these movements on demand curve takes place because of change in the price. If the demand is increasing because of decrease in the price, we call it as an expansion. Okay, whereas whenever the demand decreases because of increase in the price, the demand will decrease and we call it as an contraction phase. And if we talk about shifts in demand curve take place because of change in the factors other than the price. Say if the income of the consumer is increasing or the taste and preference of the consumers are changing, and because of that if the demand increases, then there will be a shift, okay, and that shift will take towards rightward. So, that is being considered to be as a shift in demand curve, and when there will be the demand decreases, the demand curve will shift towards left. So, these were the topic we have covered up in our previous session, and now let us move out to the further topics of this section we are going to cover. So, let us have a look on the learning objective, what all we are going to learn from today's session. Here first of all we will understand about the concept of law of demand. Thereafter, we will also look at the reasons how this law of demand exists and what kind of relationship is being shown here in law of demand. Thereafter, we will talk about law of diminishing marginal utility and its relationship with law of demand. We will also analyze the exceptions where the law of demand will not work. Then we will also talk about the supply. As we know, we have talked about demand, and demand is also important for us, same is the case of supply, as because they are both the two sides of a coin. So, here in this session we are also going to talk about what supply is, what are the determinants of supply, what is the law of supply, how we will talk about supply schedule, supply curve as well as shifts in supply curve. So, let us begin with the very first topic where we are going to talk about law of demand. Law of demand is basically the law which states that keeping other thing constant, or you can also call it as in ceteris paribus. As you know that this is the assumption we make where we need to study the impact of only one variable over the dependent variable. As we all know, demand is being affected by various determinants, right. There can be income which can create a change in the demand, price of related goods can change, advertisement effect can be there are a lot of determinants which can affect the demand. But here as in the law of demand, we are only establishing the relationship between the price and demand, and we are seeing that how much demand will be changed because of change in the price. So, for that we need to assume the situation where we have assumed the other factors to be constant. That means, we have assumed that there will be no change taking place in the income, in the taste and preference, in the price of related goods and so on. So, as per the Professor Samuelson, he defines law of demand, states that people will buy at lower price and buys less at higher price. So, what does that mean? That whenever the prices are low, people will demand more, and whenever the prices are high, the demand will be less, keeping other things same. And what are these other things? The determinants which can affect the demand. So, it is assumed that other determinants of demand are constant, and it is only the price is the variable and the influencing factor. So, we are only studying the impact of price over the demand. So, law of demand says that price is the factor which affects the demand of the commodity X, keeping the price of the X. And as because there is an inverse relationship, whenever the price of the commodity X will increase, the demand for commodity X will decrease. So, this is how we basically write the function, demand function for law of demand, that demand for commodity X is the function of price of commodity X, right. Here we are only studying the impact of price. One thing which is very much important for all of you to understand here is, law of demand is applicable only in the short run, right. We cannot consider this law in a longer period of time, as because we have assumed the other factors to be constant. We have assumed that the income of the consumer is constant, their taste and preferences are constant, price of related goods are constant. So, we cannot assume them to be constant for the longer period of time. So, this law is applicable only in the short run. If we want to study the impact of price on the demand, we can assume these factors to be constant, but for a shorter period of time. So, the existence of this law is in the short run only, right. So, moving ahead, let us look at the characteristics of law of demand derived from the definition which we have studied. What we are saying, the very first thing which is very important to understand is the inverse relationship. This we have already understood, that price is inversely related to the demand. Whenever the price will increase, quantity demanded will decrease. So, there is an inverse relationship. Secondly, what we are saying here is price an independent variable and demand a dependent variable. Now, this is something very important for all of us to understand, that here it is the impact of price we are studying on demand, not the effect of demand on price. Whenever there will be a change in price, then demand will be affected. So, we are considering price as an independent variable and demand as an dependent variable. Okay. So, this you have to understand, where we are studying the impact of price on the demand, not the impact of demand on the price, right. In law of demand we study it this way. And lastly, we are saying that we have to assume this other factors remain same or constant, otherwise we would not be able to make this study. This law of demand study is not possible if we are not assuming the other factors to be constant. So, this is how we understand the characteristics of law of demand. Now, let us look at the law of diminishing marginal utility. We will continue with law of demand after this discussion of law of diminishing marginal utility, because this law is again very important for all of us to understand, and this law of diminishing marginal utility also relates with law of demand, that we will discuss in our further classes. So, let us look at the law of diminishing marginal utility. What does this law says? As per the law of diminishing marginal utility for successive unit consumed goes on decreasing. So, this basically states that as and when we keep on consuming something, the marginal utility of those things keeps on decreasing. And the very simple example for understanding this law of diminishing marginal utility is, if somebody is feeling hungry, right. So, the first chapati which he or she eats gives the maximum satisfaction to that person, right. But when the person takes the another chapati, then that satisfaction will not be the same the first chapati has given to that person. So, as and when the person keep on consuming the chapatis, the utility keeps on decreasing because all these chapatis are capable of satisfying the hunger of that person, and there will be a point where that person is not going to have any more of it because the hunger of that person will be satisfied. So, this is how we define this law of diminishing marginal utility, that as and when you keep on consuming any commodity, its marginal utility keeps on diminishing because your satisfaction which you are getting out of that commodity keeps on reducing. So, as you consume more and more unit of a commodity, total utility will go on increasing. Definitely the total utility will increase because you will sum it up, whereas, but up to the certain point, but beyond which if you continue to consume any subsequent unit, any further unit of that commodity, the total utility will also start decreasing, and this is being called as law of diminishing marginal utility. So, let me give you a clear understanding of this law of diminishing marginal utility with this example. Let us suppose there is a person named Somil, and this person is having a strong liking for sandwiches, right. Now, we are going to calculate the total utility as well as the marginal utility, and here in this first column we are showing these units of consumption. So, when the person has not consumed any unit, the total utility was 0 and there was no marginal utility, but as and when he started consuming the very first unit of this sandwich which he was liking very much, the total utility derived out of this consumption was 20, and the marginal utility will always be same in the very first case, right. Whereas, after the consumption of the second unit, you can see the total utility increased from 20 to 36, but the marginal utility reduces from 20 to 16. How are we calculating this marginal utility? Basically, this marginal utility is the change, right. Change after the consumption of one unit, one extra unit which you have consumed, and after the consumption of that unit, what utility you have derived out of it. Utility is basically the satisfaction, okay. In economics we call it as an utility. Utility means the satisfaction you are getting out of the consumption of that particular commodity. So, the difference between 36 and 20 is 16, and this is how we have calculated the marginal utility as and when the person keeps on consuming this commodity, right. So, here you can see up to the point this total utility was increasing up to this 5th unit of the consumption, whereas with the 6th unit of consumption total utility is also not increasing, and thereafter it has started decreasing because this person is not able to have more of the units, right. The hunger of that person is satisfied, right. Whereas, if you talk about the marginal utility, it is decreasing since the beginning, and there is a point where it reaches to 0, and if you are going to consume further, then it might goes in negative, right. So, Samul till the Samul had not consumed any sandwich, his satisfaction level was nil like I said, and the total utility was 0. But the very first sandwich gave him the maximum satisfaction, that is of 20 unit, because he has a strong desire to have one. We can see that total utility is increasing with each successive sandwiches, but the marginal utility is declining. So, let us move with it further with this example. As I have told you, with the 6th sandwich, that has given him the no additional satisfaction, right. Up to the 5th unit which he has consumed, the total utility was increasing, but with the consumption of total 6th unit, his total utility was also not increasing, and the marginal utility for the 6th sandwich was 0. So, now this is the point where we need to understand that consuming further any unit will not give any kind of a utility to that person, and the marginal utility will be 0. So, these are the graphs which basically help you to understand the total utility pattern as well as the marginal utility, and we have drawn these graphs on the basis of the figures we have used in this column, right. So, as you can see, initially the total utility was 0 and then it increases up to the point, and thereafter it started decreasing. So, this is how we represent this total utility curve, starting from 0, initially it increases, keeps on increasing, and then at the point of time it goes downwards, right. Whereas, marginal utility, since marginal utility was nil when the consumption was not taken up, and then it keeps on decreasing, right. So, since the beginning the marginal utility of a commodity keeps on decreasing, and up to a point it will reach to 0, and if you will still continue your consumption, then marginal utility will go negative, which does not give any kind of a satisfaction. which person is not going to do, right. So, this is how we understand this law of diminishing marginal utility, that how much satisfaction are we going to get from the consumption of any commodity, because whatever we are purchasing or whatever we are buying, we need to make a sacrifice, and that sacrifice we are actually making in terms of money, right. So, we try to keep our satisfaction up to the point where we are getting the benefit out of it. We are not going to pay for anything where we are not getting any benefit of it, right. So, further continuing our discussion of law of diminishing marginal utility, to understand this law, here also we have certain assumption, like to understand the law of demand, we have made the assumptions keeping other factors to be constant. In the same case, when we are talking about law of diminishing marginal utility, and to understand this law clearly, we have to again make certain assumption. So, let us look at the very first assumption. The very first assumption say that the unit of consumption must be a standard one. Now, this is very important, right. The sandwich which we were talking about in the case of sawmill, right, that size of the sandwich should be standard one. Too large or too small size of any commodity will not hold this law good, okay. So, if we have given small bites of sandwiches to the sawmill, then definitely his total utility or marginal utility would have not been declined, right. So, the size or the standard size of that commodity should be a standard size, not very small, not very large. Secondly, the consumption must be a continuous consumption. Again, whatever the person is consuming, like if he is having sandwiches, that the consumption of sandwiches should be taken up on a continuous basis, right. If the sawmill has taken one piece of sandwich in the morning and then one in the afternoon and then last in the midnight, then there would have been no change, or the utility would have not been declined, right. So, it is again very important to hold this law validate. It is important to consume that commodity on a continuous basis, then only the marginal utility of that commodity will diminish. Then the third point says that multiple unit of the commodity should be consumed. Yes, this law actually holds good in case of those goods which are of recurring nature, right. This law is not this law does not works on the durable goods, durable consumable goods like furniture. If you have purchased furniture today, you are not going to purchase it again and again. If you have purchased car today, you are not going to buy it again and again, right. You can't have a multiple unit of those things. But yes, it holds true for those goods which are of recurring nature like eatables, okay, which you have consumed once and then you can demand more of those commodity. So, this is again important. Then next we have talked about the taste and preference. Taste and preference of the consumer should also remain unchanged during the consumption, right. So, if you remember guys, I have started my example with the saying that sawmill has a strong liking to have sandwich, right. So, this is something which you need to understand, that in case of the consumption of any commodity, suppose he also likes to have coffee. So, if you are after the third unit of the sandwich, if you offer coffee to sawmill, then his marginal utility again will not diminish, it might increase, right. So, the taste of preference of a person, if a person is eating something and suddenly if a person changes the taste and start having something else, then the marginal utility will not diminish, okay. So, the point here to understand here is, to hold this law true or to validate this law, we need to understand whatever you are taking for the consumption, that taste and preference of a person should remain same during that point of time, and good should be normal, not addictive in nature. That is also very important. Whatever the good person is consuming, that this law does not holds true on the items which are of addictive nature, because in that case maybe their marginal utility will not decline, it might go up. Maybe in the case of tea, or if a person is having a habit of smoking, then those kind of goods will not holds true with the study of law of diminishing marginal utility. So, I hope this law of diminishing marginal utility is clear to every one of you, where we are studying this law to understand how the consumption of any commodity diminishes the marginal utility of that commodity, and we can only study this law with the help of these assumptions. So, now let us move to the next heading, where we are going to further talk about the law of demand, right. So, going back to the law of demand, now we are going to study how this law of demand works and what are the reasons behind this law of demand. So, here we have 5 points to discuss to understand how this law of demand is going to work. The very first point is the substitution effect. Now, how this substitution effect is going to work? Basically, these 2 points, substitution effect and income effect, are also called as price effect. Okay. So, how this substitution effect and income effect is going to affect this law of demand? Let me tell you with an example. Substitution effect. Substitute goods are those goods which can be used in place of one other. Let us take an example of tea and coffee, right. So, we are talking about the very first point, substitution. Tea and coffee are the substitute of each other. Suppose the price of tea increases, right. So, what will happen? The demand for coffee will increase, because ultimately what we are saying, when price of tea will increase, the demand for tea will go down. With the same commodity, when price of any commodity increases, the demand for the same commodity will decrease, but the demand for the substitute commodity will increase, keeping that into consideration that automatically the price of that commodity decreases, right. Suppose the price of tea was 10 and the price of coffee was also 10, right, per cup. When the price of tea increases from 10 to 11 rupees, so demand for tea will decrease. This is for the same commodity, but when we see the impact on the substitute commodity, now the people, those who were liking to drink tea, now because the price of tea increases, they shifted their demand towards coffee. Now automatically the price of coffee reduces, it has not changed, but in comparison to tea, the price of coffee is still 10 and price of tea is now 11 rupees. So people will shift towards the substitute good. Okay, that is why we say when price of any commodity increases, the demand for that commodity decreases, because people try to substitute that commodity, people try to buy the substitute goods of those commodity, and because of that demand of that specific commodity decreases. So, this is what has been known as substitution effect, right. Then the next one is your income effect. Coming to the next point, we have this income effect. How does this income effect work? Now, you need to recall one thing again, there is no change in the income, right. Income is the same, because we have already assumed other factors to be constant. If you remember, law of demand says that keeping other thing constant, whenever the price increases, demand decreases and vice versa. So, we need to be understood that thing, that income is not increasing, but our purchasing power is affecting with the change in the price of any commodity. Suppose the price of apple per kg is 50 rupees, right, and you are having 100 rupees with you. So, how much apple you can buy? You can buy 2 kgs apple, because you are having 100 rupees with you and per kg apple costs 50 rupees. So, that means you can easily buy 2 kgs apple with this 100 rupees. And now, let us assume that price of apple increases from 50 rupees to 100 rupees. Okay, suppose in anyhow the price of apple increases from 50 rupees to 100 rupees. So, the price has increased, the income of the person remains the same, still you are having 100 rupees, but now because of increase in the price of apple, with the same income you are now able to buy only 1 kgs of apple, right, because your purchasing power reduces because of increase in the price of that commodity, right. So, I hope all of you are understanding this point, how I am going I am trying to tell you about the income effect. It creates the effect on your income, right, where your purchasing power either increases or decreases. Suppose the price of apple reduces from 50 rupees to 25 rupees, right. So, how much apple now you can buy with this 100 rupees? Now, you will be able to buy 4 kgs of apple with the same amount, right. So, the price when increases, your purchasing power decreases, because of which you are able to demand less of that commodity, whereas when price reduces, your purchasing power increases, and with that you can buy more of that commodity. So, see how the law of demand we are able to justify with this income effect, right. It is not the change in the income which is taking place, it is the change in the purchasing power of a person taking place because of change in the price of a commodity. Now, next is law of diminishing marginal utility. This law we have already understood, and that is the purpose where I have explained this law of diminishing marginal utility. Now we are going to understand how this law of diminishing marginal utility relates to the law of demand. Suppose we have let us take the example of apple again. Here we have quantity of apples and here we have marginal utilities of apple, which say we are talking about in passive, right. When we have one quantity of apple, the marginal utility which we are getting, that is 100 paisa. Okay. With the consumption of second unit of apple, we are getting the marginal utility say around of 80 paisa. With the consumption of third unit of apple, we are getting the marginal utility of around 60 paisa, right. So, as you can see, as and when we are consuming the more and more units of apple, our marginal utility is declining, right, and that we have already understood why this marginal utility of a person declines when we consume more and more unit of that commodity. But now, as you know that whatever we purchase, okay, whatever we buy from the market, we need to pay for it, nothing comes for free, right. And being a rational person, we always analyze the cost and benefit, right. We are always ready to pay up to the point where benefits are more than the cost, okay. And we can also buy up to the point where benefits are equals to the cost or where price is equals to the utility, right. But we will never try to pay beyond the point where utility is less and prices are more, okay. So, the point of understanding here is a person would like to spend the income up to the point where the price is equals to the utility, but definitely a person would not like to spend their income on any of the commodity where the utility is less and the price is more. As we are saying that the marginal utilities keeps on decreasing. So, when apple is 100 paisa, we will buy only one quantity. If the price of apple reduces to 80 paisa, we will buy 2 units of apple, and when the price of apple reduces to 60 paisa, we can buy 3 units of apple. So, you can see that when the price of commodity is decreasing, the person can demand more of that commodity, because here they are comparing the price of that commodity with the utility they are driving out of it, right. People want to pay where utility is more than price, but they can also buy up to the point where price is equals to the utility, but not where utility is lesser than the price. So, this is how we establish the relationship of marginal utility with the law of demand. I hope all of you have understood this clearly. Going back to the reasons underlying law of demand, we have another point here which is called as new consumers, right. New consumers are also being added to the commodity whenever the price reduces, right. Whenever the price reduces, the people who were not able to afford it earlier, now they also been added to the consumption of that commodity. So, definitely the demand of that commodity will increase, and maybe the earlier consumers who were demanding them now are capable of demanding it more. So, whenever the price reduces, new consumers also add to that purchasing list of that commodity. So, definitely the demand of that commodity will increase. And then we have the last reason here, which is called as different uses of commodities. There are certain commodities which can be used for different purposes, right. So, different purposes like electricity can be used for different purposes, like steel can be used for different purposes, like wood can be used for the different purposes. So, there are different commodities like milk can be used for different purposes, right. So, there are different commodities which can be used for different purposes, but what happens when the price of these commodities are higher side, then we try to use these commodities for a very specific purpose where they cannot be substitute. But yes, when the price of these commodities decreases, we try to use them as and when we can use it, or more and more we can use it, right. So, that is why the demand for those commodities increases. So, these are the reasons behind law of demand, and which holds law of demands true and able to establish the relationship that whenever the price of any commodity increases, its demand decreases, and that happens because of the substitutions available in the market, because of the change in the purchasing power of a person, because of law of diminishing marginal utility, where the person always compare the price with the utility they are deriving out of it, and as because the utility keeps on diminishing. So, a person will be able to demand more of that commodity only when the prices are lesser, right. new consumers also added to that group, and lastly we have talked about the different uses of a commodity. The items will be demanded more and more when the prices are less, and that particular item can be used for different purposes, but when the prices are high we try to use it for a very specific purpose where we cannot substitute it. Okay. Now, let us move to the next topic where we are going to talk about the exceptions of law of demand. Now, what are these exceptions? Law of demand says that whenever the price of any commodity increases, its demand decreases, but that is not in every cases. It is not possible that in each and every case the price of commodity increases and their demand decreases. There are certain cases where this law of demand does not hold good. So, let us start with the very first point where we are going to talk about given goods. Now, what are these given goods? Given goods are basically the special type of inferior goods, and we also call it as a Giffen paradox, because these are the goods which are being studied by Sir Robert Giffen, and on his name only we are calling them as in given goods. Actually, this was a study which was made in the Ireland, where the people are very poor and they were having two things only for the consumption. One was the meat and the other was the bread. Right. So, for them meat was the superior good and the bread was the inferior good, and as because they were having very limited income, so they were consuming both of them, and definitely they were not able to spend more of the meat because they were not having more income to spend on it because it was a superior good. So, they used to have more of bread to satisfy their hunger. But what happened when the price of bread increases, right? When the price of bread increases, as per the law of demand, the demand for bread should have reduced, but in this paradox, the consumption of bread was not reduced, but in fact it was increased, right? Because still the price of bread was comparatively lesser than the price of meat, because there were only two commodities. So, they were comparing those two commodities, one as an inferior and the other was an superior good. So, when the price of this inferior good increases, but still the increased price of the bread was lesser than the price of meat. So, therefore, the people have not reduced its consumption, but still they are having that consumption, or even they were demanding it more, right. So, these are the special categories of inferior goods, and in case of given goods, law of demand does not exist. That means, whenever the price of these goods increases, their demand does not decreases. Now, the second is your snob appeal or Veblen goods, or we can also call them as in social status goods. Now, these are the goods which are having a impact on the people for maintaining their society, and that is why we are calling them as in snob appeal, the goods which have snob appeal, right, which people wants to show for their status. And why do we call them as in Veblen goods? Again, these are the goods which are studied by Veblen. So, we call them on his name. So, these are also being called as Veblen good. Social status good, like wearing diamond jewelry or having antique paintings in your house. Here in these cases, people are not considering the law of demand, because price of these commodities are very high and still people are demanding them, because they want to show their social status, right, because they want to show how they are representing their status in the society. So, in such cases also law of demand will not work. Then we have demonstration effect. Now, demonstration effect is again the effect where we are influenced by some person, right, where we are following some person because we consider that person as an idol, and whatever that person is doing, we are also doing the same thing irrespective of the price. And that is why you can see that the advertisements are usually being endorsed by the celebrities, because we keep these celebrities as our idol and we like to follow them, we like to do whatever they are doing. So, whatever they are advertising, whatever the product they are advertising, we try to buy those things and we try to do all those things because of that, because they are demonstrating it, right. So, in such cases we are following that person, we are following the words of those person rather than looking at the price of that commodity. We are being influenced by them. So, there also law of demand will not work. We like to do those things which they are asking us to do, or whatever they are doing we try to do those things. So, here we are being influenced by the people, therefore, in demonstration effect also law of demand does not work. Then we have future expectation of prices. Yes, future expectation of prices means what is your expectation with the price of that commodity. Law of demand is saying that when the price of a commodity is increasing, the demand for that commodity will decrease. So, what happen in case if the price is already high of some commodity, but the future expectation of that commodity is that the prices are going to high further, right, or further there will be an increase in the price of that commodity. Suppose the case of an example of gold we can take, right, already the price of gold is high, but still the people are expecting that further in future the prices will go up. So, they have increased their demand with keeping the expectation with the future prices. Even on the higher price they are demanding it more, because they are expecting that the price will go further in future, right. So, again with the future expectation of price, if you are expecting that in future the prices will go further up, you are still demanding that commodity on the higher price. The next is the insignificant portion of income spent. Yes, this is again important. On the purchase of commodities where you are spending very insignificant proportion of your income. Suppose you are earning very good, right, your salary is very good, and if the price of a candle increases, right, if the price of candle increases from 10 rupees maybe to 12 rupees or maybe to 13 rupees, will you change the demand of your commodity for that product? Definitely not, because the amount which you are spending on the purchase of that commodity is very insignificant as compared to your income, right. If there will be a change in the price of a matchbox, right, so what will you do? Will you reduce the demand of that commodity? Definitely no, you will not reduce it, right. It will not going to impact much to you, but obviously if you would have been spending the significant portion of your income, suppose if you want to buy a refrigerator, if you want to buy a television, right, and if there will be a change in the price of those commodity, definitely your demand will get affected. But for the goods where you are spending very insignificant portion of your income, right, and when the price of those commodities changes, then the demand for such commodities will not get affected. Therefore, in such cases also law of demand will not hold good. Next is goods with no substitute, right. So, as I think it is clear to every one of you, when you have no choices left with you, definitely the law of demand will not work. Price of petrol increases and you are having a petrol car, you have no choice, right. You will have to demand it on a higher price only, right, because suddenly you cannot change your car into a diesel car or maybe into a CNG car or maybe an electric vehicle, right. It will take a considerable time, but in short run law of demand will not hold true for those goods where you are not left with any substitute, where there is no other alternative left to you, you have to demand it even on the higher prices. In case of emergencies, yes, in case of a sudden war, right, in case of some medical situation, right, law of demand will not work. If doctor is asking you to take certain medicine from certain shops or maybe from the hospital, and there is an emergency, you do not have a time, right. So, you are not left with any choices, even on the higher price you have to demand, right. So, in case of emergencies, people are not considering this law of demand, they just have to buy that product because it is a need of an hour. So, here people are not going to consider the price of that commodity. So, definitely the law of demand also not work in case of emergencies. Then we have consumer psychology's bias or illusion. Now, what is this? In certain cases, consumer have a kind of an illusion, or they have this kind of a psychological belief where they say that whenever the price of a commodity reduces, the quality also reduces. So, if you have that kind of a perception, if you have that kind of a psychology in your mind where you believe when the price of any commodity reduces, its quality also deteriorates, right, its quality also reduces, then definitely you will buy those commodities which will be pricing more, right. So, this psychological belief or illusion in the mind of the consumer will also buy more of those commodities where the prices are more. So, here law of demand will not work. Items of addiction. So, items of addictions are those items which people want to have it irrespective of the price, even if the prices goes up they will demand it, and because of this reason government charges more of the taxes on these items, right, because they are of addictive nature. Even if the government will add more prices to it in terms of taxes, people will demand them, people will buy them, right. So, item of addictions are such items where again law of demand will not work. Then we have irrational behavior of the consumer. Sometimes consumers behave irrationally, right. They go to the market and they buy things and they do impulse shopping, right. Do not keep the consideration of price and the utility, they just buy it. So, some of the consumers also behave irrationally, and if they are behaving irrationally, but we have assumed this assumption in the very beginning, and economics holds true on this belief that we all are rational people, and whatever we are doing, whatever we are doing as a customer or as a consumer, as a producer, we always behave rationally, we always calculate the cost and benefit. But there are cases where people are behaving irrationally, they are buying goods like that only, or they are making impulse shopping, right, irrespective of their price and the utility which they are going to get out of it. There also this law of demand will not work. And lastly, demand for necessary goods also do not validate this law of demand, because here people are going to demand those goods because they are necessary goods. Even if the price of those goods will increase, like food items, even if the price of those goods increases, we have to demand them, like medicines, like food. So, these are the necessary things. So, here also in this case law of demand will not hold true. So, if you go back and revise these headings once again, what all are the things which are not being considered in the law of demand, or where the law of demand does not hold good? The very first cases of the given goods. Given goods are the special categories of inferior goods, and in this case whenever the price will increase, demand for these goods will not decrease. Snob appeal goods are your social status goods which you are buying to show your status in the society. Then we have demonstration effect. Here you are being influenced by some person and you try to follow that person, you try to do those things what that person is doing, you are associating yourself with that person, and you buy things irrespective of the prices, right. Future expectation of the price. If you are expecting the price of any commodity will rise in the future, even at the present price is already high, but you are expecting that the price will further go up. So, you demand more of that commodity at present. Insignificant proportion of income spent, the items on which you are spending very insignificant proportion of your income, which is not going to impact you much. So, demand for those commodities will not affect it, right. Even if their price increases, you might be demanding the same quantity, or you can demand more of that. Goods without substitute, where you are not left with any choices, again the law of demand will not work. In case of emergencies, law of demand will not work. Consumer have a psychology where they are associating the price with the quality of the commodity. So, here the consumers will buy those products which are of higher prices rather than buying those goods which are lesser in price. In case of items of addiction, people are addicted to certain goods, they would like to do or to buy those goods because they are addictive items. So, here also price will not play a role for the demand of any commodity. Irrational behavior of a consumer, if a person is behaving irrationally, not considering the utility which the person is going to get out of that commodity, the price which they are paying for it. So, in that case also law of demand will not work. And demand for necessary goods, right, the items which are of necessities, there also we cannot go with the prices because they are necessary items. Now, let us move to the next part of our topic, where we are going to talk about supply. Enough of discussion has already been made for the demand. We have discussed everything of demand, but now the important aspect is to understand supply, because again without the study of supply we won't be able to find out the relative importance of demand. As we can say, they both are the two sides of a coin. So, two blades of a scissor which goes together, right. Just like demand indicate the willingness of a purchaser to buy particular commodity, supply means the willingness of a firm to sell a particular commodity. If you guys remember, for the accomplishment of demand we have discussed that a person should have a desire to buy for it, right, and having a willingness and an ability to pay for it, and that is from the consumer side, because demand is always takes place from the consumer side, whereas supply takes place from the producer side. So, supply will be there when a person is having a willingness and an ability to supply that commodity, then only supply will be possible. So, we can say that supply refers to the quantity of goods and services that a seller is willing to and able to provide at a price at a given point of time, ceteris paribus. Keeping other thing constant, when a supplier is ready to supply and is able to supply particular goods and services at a provided price as well as a point of time, then it would be considered to be as in supply, right. Now, moving ahead, first we will talk about equilibrium, right. Equilibrium is what? Is a state of balance. So, here in the equilibrium we need to understand when the market will be in equilibrium, right. So, for that demand and supply plays a very important role, and the point where demand is equals to the supply, that particular point would be considered to be as an equilibrium point. So, equilibrium is a situation in which there is no tendency for change, right. So, it is that situation where there is no tendency of change, things are at equal pace. A market will be in equilibrium where there is no reason for the market price of the product to rise or fall, right. Why there is a change in the price? Because of change in the demand and supply, we all know, right. These are the two important forces of the market, demand and supply, and because of this only the price get affected. When demand is more, supply is less, then price will increase. When demand is less, supply is more, price will decrease. So, when they both are equal, then price will remain same, there will be no change taking place in the price. So, this occurs at the price where quantity demanded is equals to the quantity supplied. When quantity demanded is equals to the quantity supplied, that is the point which we are referring to as an equilibrium position in the market, and there will be no need of change in the price required. So, at this price the amount that consumer wishes to buy is the same as the amount that the producers wishes to sell. So, the price will be what the consumer is ready to buy and on the price at which the seller is ready to sell. Now, you can look at this this particular table where you can understand this equilibrium position. Here we have three columns, one is representing the quantity demanded, the middle one represents the price, and the third column we are having the quantity supplied, right. As you can see, whenever the price is increasing, the demand is decreasing, because there is always an inverse relationship, right. Consumer will always want to demand lesser on the higher price, whereas because supply is from the producer side and they want to supply more and more when the prices are high, because that will give them the benefit. So, here you can see when the prices are more, they are supplying more, and when the prices are less, they try to supply less. So, here the equilibrium occurs at price 3. Now, this is the price where the equilibrium occurs, because here the consumer is also willing to buy 8 unit of that commodity, and the supplier is also willing to sell 8 unit of that commodity, and this is the point where we are in equilibrium phase, because here the supply and demand is equal, consumer is ready to pay for this much of price and supplier is also ready to sell at this price. So, this is how we understand the situation of equilibrium in the market, right, and this is how we represent this curve. Demand curve is a downward sloping curve which represented with the red color, and supply curve is a upward sloping curve which we are representing here in a purple color, and this is the state of equilibrium where the demand is equals to the supply and the price and quantity demanded will remain same, right. So, if there will be any change taking place in this demand and supply, only then there will be a change in the price and quantity demanded will take place, right. So, it is very important for us to understand when our market will be in equilibrium phase, and this equilibrium phase is basically the ideal condition which never happens, because we cannot work in this equilibrium phase, right. These are the two forces which work, but definitely we are not at equilibrium phase. Always there is a difference in the demand and supply, but for the understanding of the subject, it is very important for all of us to know what is meant by the market equilibrium. Our market will be in an equilibrium stage when quantity demanded is exactly equal to the quantity supplied. Now, moving further, let us look at the determinants of supply. Like we have talked about the determinants of demand, we do have the determinants of supply, and the very first is your price of commodity. So, if the price of commodity X will change, what will be the impact on quantity supplied of commodity X? Like I said, there is a positive relationship, because here we are talking from the producer side, and producer will get more benefit when the prices are more, right. The producer wants to supply more on the higher prices. So, price here is having a positive relationship with the quantity supplied in supply case, whereas in demand case, price is inversely related to the demand, because consumer would like to buy more on the lesser price and lesser on the higher price. So, here price of a commodity is having a positive relationship. Now, next is the cost of production. For supply, cost of productions matter a lot, right. Cost of production includes the cost of land, labor, capital, all the resources which we are using for the production. So, if the cost of production is higher, right, then definitely the supply will be lesser, because the producer will be able to produce less, because cost of production is high. But if the cost of production is less, the producer will be able to produce more and supply more, right. So, in case of cost of production, it is inversely related. Cost of production is inversely related with the supply. Lesser cost, higher supply, higher cost, lesser supply. Then state of technology. Yes, the better the state of technology, the advanced technology which you will be using, definitely there will be more supply. So, better will be the technology, more will be the supply. Poor or lesser technology you are using, then lesser will be the supply. So, again in the case of state of technology, there is a positive relationship, right. Number of firms, more supply, lesser firm, lesser supply. So, again there is a positive relationship. Then we have government policies as well. Government policies also impact supplies a lot, as you all know. Government plays a very important role. They also provide subsidies, and they also charges the taxes. So, in case of the commodities where the subsidies are being given, the producer can supply more of that commodity, and when the heavy taxes are being charged from the producer, then in those cases the supply will be lesser, right. So, these are some of the determinants I have written here for the discussion, and how you will be able to understand the impact of quantity supplied because of change in the determinants of supply. And again, the most prominent factor is the price of the commodity. As in the case of demand, we have price of the commodity, how it has affected the demand of that commodity. Same in the case of a supply, price of that commodity will have a major impact, and here it is having a positive relationship. Now, let us move to the next point, where we are going to understand the supply function. Now, what is the supply function? Supply function is again a mathematical relationship between the supply and its determinants. Okay. So, when we express mathematically the relationship between the supply being a dependent variable, and all the other determinants which we have talked about are the independent variable, because it is the impact of these determinants we are studying on supply, right. So, the supply of a product X is the function of supply of commodity X, is the function of price of the commodity X, cost of production, technology, government policies, number of firm. So, this is how we represent the supply function, the way we have represented the demand function, right. The more and more determinants we are going to study, this is how we explain it, right. It is a kind of a mathematical expression we are representing here in the form of supply function. Moving ahead, we have law of supply. Just now we have studied about law of demand, and law of demand state that keeping other factors constant, whenever we see that price increases, demand decreases. Now, the opposite we are going to study in the supply. Again, here we need to make the assumption that keeping other factors to be constant, that is ceteris paribus, whenever the price of a commodity increases, supply also increases, the quantity supplied will increase. So, the law of supply states that other things remaining the same, that means we have assumed the other determinants to be constant. The higher the price of the commodity, the greater is the quantity supplied, because that will benefit the supplier, right. And this is how we state this law of supply function here, because we are only studying the price of that commodity. The supply is basically the function of price of the commodity X, right? Price of the commodity X is the only function which is affecting the supply of the commodity X, and the logic is easy to understand because price of the commodity is the revenue to the supplier. Why the supplier wants to supply more on the higher price? Because price is going to give the revenue to the firm. Therefore, higher price means the greater revenue to the supplier, hence greater is the incentive to the suppliers. For that reason, they want to supply more and more on the higher prices. Moving ahead, we have this is supply schedule. Supply schedule is again just a tabular representation of law of supply, what we have seen. Here these are the points which we are going to draw on the supply curve, and then you can see these are the prices given, and this is the supply for per cup per month, right. So, when the price was rupees 15, the supply was 10,000 because we are studying it in thousands per cup per month, right. And as and when the prices are increasing, supply is also increasing, keeping into consideration that supplier wants to supply more on the higher prices. Looking at the supply curve, right, this is again a graphical representation of what we have seen in the supply schedule. This is how we represent this supply curve. This is the graphical representation of the supply schedule, and it represents the quantity supplied of a commodity at different price level, right. You can see that the supply curve is always upward sloping, indicating that there is a positive relationship between the price and the quantity supplied. Here on the x axis we are talking about quantity supplied because this is a dependent variable, and on the y axis we always consider price of that commodity, right. So, when the price was rupees 10, 15 around, then the supply was 10, price increases to 30, supply also increases to the 30. So, this is how we represent the supply curve. Again, supply curve can be linear or it can be non-linear depending upon the effect changes place in the quantity supplied due to the change in the prices. Moving ahead, we have shifts in supply curve, and like I said and discussed the shifts and movements in the demand curve. So, as we have shifts in demand curve, shift means the supply curve will shift towards right or shift towards left again, right. So, here shifts in supply curve will take place because of change in the factors other than the price. If there is any change in the determinant taking any change in the determinant taking place of supply other than the price, then the supply curve will shift either right or left. So, here I can show this curve how the shifts in supply curve takes place. This is how we represent the supply curve, which is upward sloping. Supply curve will shift towards right, downward shift will take place when the supply increases, right. So, here we have three things written here: input price, technology and number of seller. As we see that input price is inversely related to the supply. So, when input prices are lesser, supply will be more. So, supply curve shift towards right. When technology is better, supply will be more. So, supply curve will shift towards right. When number of sellers are more, then supply will be more. Supply will shift towards right. So, these are the factors which causes a shift to the supply. Whereas, if you look at the left side, we have the supply curve where we are representing the quantity supplied reduces because of the change in the input prices. If the input price increases, supply will decrease. When the technology states decreases, supply will decrease, and when the number of seller decreases, supply will decrease, and the supply curve will shift towards back, right, that is towards the left side, and the shifts will takes place. Okay. So, one thing which you need to understand here is shifts in supply curve are taking place because of change in the factors other than price, and movements takes place because of change in the price, right. So, this is what we have discussed today, and if we revise our topic for today, these are the headings which we have covered in our today's session, where we have talked about law of demand, right, which states that keeping other factors to be constant, whenever the price of any commodity increases, the demand for that commodity decreases and vice versa, right. Thereafter, we have talked about the law of diminishing marginal utility, which states that as in when we keep on consuming any commodity, its marginal utility keeps on decreasing, right. So, marginal utility, law of diminishing marginal utility holds true on the basis of certain assumptions. Those assumptions we have discussed, right. then only we would be able to study this law of diminishing marginal utility. What are the reasons behind law of demand, why this law of demand holds true, and why when price increases demand decreases? That happens because of the substitution effect, because of the substitute availability in the market, because of the income effect where income does not changes, but yes, the purchasing power get affected, because of law of diminishing marginal utility, right, where people would like to make a purchase up to the point where utility is more than price or utility is equals to the price, right, or new consumers also been added to that group, and law of demand holds true because of new consumer or the different uses of the commodity. Some commodities are used for different purposes, so they are being demanded for that. Then thereafter we have talked about exceptions to law of demand. We have discussed the situation and the cases where law of demand does not exist, right, where the price of commodity increases even if their demand does not decreases. So, those were the exceptions to law of demand. Then we have talked about supply, where we have seen that supply increases whenever there is an increase in the price. What is the equilibrium situation in the economy? It occurs when quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied. Then what are the determinants of supply we have discussed? Law of supply, like it states that keeping other thing constant, when price increases quantity supplied also increases. And lastly we have talked about supply function, schedule, curve, and how shift in supply curve takes place. So, this is all for this session, and here these are the books written from, the references are being taken up. Thank you all of you.